All right, so welcome everyone again to the ninth Tea Talk conversation of the Tea Talk series with this Tea Talk title, Transportation and Job Access. We are already excited and we're really excited to see many of you here. But before we begin, we want to do a poll to see who was in the room with us. So if you could put your zip code in the chat, that would be awesome. And if you don't know your zip code, putting in your neighborhood is fine. First, we would like to thank our supporters of the Transportation Talk series, or this one for this year, T4MA, Transportation for Massachusetts, and the Bar Foundation. What are the Tea Talks and who are they for? So Alyssa and I created this space for community. The Tea Talks are a chance for us to explore together what changes in our community really mean to us and what residents who live in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, and parts of Hyde Park, and those who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color are thinking when they hear and see these changes. They are also for those individuals who aren't normally in the transportation world. And so I want to present, sorry, I'm having a hard time talking today, but that's okay. I hope you all had a good day today, but I had a long day. And so to introduce you to the organizers of the Tea Talk. So my name is Chevelle Olivier, or Chevelle Olivier. I'm a Mattapan resident, but I'm also the executive director of Mattapan Food and Fitness Coalition. And at MFFC, we focus on health and wellness. We focus on activities around food access, nutrition, education, physical activity, youth development, looking at the way that our environment looks, and then community empowerment. And I'll turn it over to Alensa, the other Tea Talk organizer, to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alensa Michelle. I'm the founder of Powerful Pathways. We're a creative urban planning and design practice, and we do a variety of different things, as you can see in the list. I'm a resident of Mattapan. I was born and raised here, and I am a user of the public transit system. I don't have a car. I got into community organizing because of my experiences growing up in this neighborhood, and the experiences of dealing with a lack of investment and lack of infrastructure. So this work is very passionate to me.
Thank you, Alensa. And so as we begin, it's really important for us to set the tone for our time together. And if you've been to our previous Tea Talks, they are the same ground rules for when we're doing these Tea Talks. And so again, the session will be recorded. We would ask that you all engage in respectful dialogue. If you do have any questions, submit them in the chat box, and then we'll be able to address them later if there's time. Please know that the questions are considered your own and not representative of your organization. And if you are here representing your organization, you should make it clear whether you're commenting or asking a question as yourself, as an individual, or as your organization. And when sharing a question, please be short and to the point, and make sure that it's not too wordy, and avoid the private chats, because I save the private chats and I can see anything and everything that is written if it's a private conversation. We want to make sure that we're practicing on one mic, step up and step back. One mic means sharing the mic. And then if you are a person that likes to talk a lot, maybe step back to allow other people to engage in conversation. Practicing active listening. Sometimes we can get passionate about something and we forget about others in the room. And sometimes our passion can cause those who are quiet not to speak up. And so we want to hear from everyone in this space. And lastly, we want to leave room for open-mindedness. Too often we are quick to reject an idea because it doesn't serve us as a person. And while we go through these series, think about others who don't have the same options of getting around the city as you do. Lastly, think about solutions. If you don't like the idea of something, ask yourself, what would you like to see instead? Sometimes we are given the opportunity to speak up and suggest changes, but spend most of our energy and emotions on rejection of that change. With this, we end up missing our opportunity to suggest changes that we would like to see. And so we do want you to walk away be able to make informed decisions and informed opinions. Our goals for you tonight, and as for every Tea Talk, is to create safety solutions for your community, understand the why behind a street change, and hopefully that you'll be able to attend more community meetings around transportation, becoming advocates for your community, and understand the intersection of transportation and quality of life. Our program for tonight will start off with a framing from Alyssa Michelle, the importance of job access. Then we'll have our guest speaker presentations, and then we'll have community Q&A should time permit. And so now I'll turn it over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Chevelle. Yeah, so let's talk about transportation equity, and specifically, like Chevelle had introduced, we've been doing these Talks for a couple years now because we really want to center on the ways in which transit intersects with other issues that impact the quality of life for residents. So today in particular, we want to talk about access to rail and how access to rail opens up the door for access to other things. Next slide, please. So what are some equity impacts of public transit accessibility? Well, first thing is improved job opportunities. In particular, when we look at the neighborhoods of Hyde Park, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury, they're on the southern side of the city and further away from downtown, where there's a large concentration of resources and opportunities that are centered around downtown. For many years, we didn't have rapid transit, and even now we're looking to improve our rapid transit options, which is why we've invited members from the Fairmount Transit Coalition and Action for Regional Equity to talk with us more later. But the idea here is really to kind of take into stock all the different ways in which improved public transit access opens the door for residents, particularly residents that are communities that are largely low income and of color like ours. So more companies will locate to places that have better transit access as well. We see this happen on a frequent basis. In particular, we saw this happen when the seaport began to really open up. There are new development opportunities tend to be centered around transit. Another way this is referred to as is transit-oriented development. So if there aren't many transit options, a business or company that can bring really good jobs are going to be less attracted to situate themselves in a given place. Then we also want to look at better access to shops amenities. It's not just about getting to jobs, it's also about getting to school, getting to your doctor's appointments, getting to the grocery store. We've done previous Talks where we centered on the topic on food justice in transit and how needing better access to places that offer fresh produce. We also discovered in our research that the neighborhoods, which used to be called food deserts, meaning there wasn't access or limited access to fresh produce. Now we do have what's called a food swamp, where there's tons of small shops and markets around, but most of them don't offer the best healthy options. So having better transit options means that you can also get around better to get to healthier foods and foods that are more affordable. This also, in another way, supports small businesses because it helps to generate more foot traffic. People are going to come and hang out to places where there is more opportunities to walk around, to sit around, to be able to jump in on the train and get to your next stop, or get on a bus and get to your next stop, and easily be able to navigate different types of amenities. So it helps to build more active business life in an area as well. And of course, there is the improved health. In general, when we talk about environmental justice, reduce traffic congestion because there's less need to use cars, reduce air pollution, which means we're not breathing in diesel particulates, which are, these emissions, which tend to be higher in low-income communities of color. As a matter of fact, the neighborhoods that we focus on are recognized by the federal government as environmental justice communities. Again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the origins of the Fairmount Transit Coalition. And it also creates the opportunity for more physical activity because you're going to be walking around more, you're going to be more active, you're going to be less sedentary and not sitting around as much. Next slide, please. There is a downside, though, to improve transit options when they are not paired with regulatory policy. And what I mean by that is whenever you bring about new transit opportunities and it starts to attract all this activity, businesses start coming around, it puts these communities at risk for displacement and gentrification. And that's why it's important to make sure that when transit improvements are being made in a given area, that they're also being minded by different types of policies and programs that help to control how much the costs are rising. Like in the case, for example, of housing, we see this happen a lot. So infrastructure is sometimes not oriented around the community's needs. It's around or attracting a more affluent base. In other words, they're trying to build people who are wealthier, who make more money. You start seeing a lot of boutique shops and things like that start coming up. And of course, we like that. We want to have access to that too. But if it's outside of the community's price range, it's going to start drawing a different crowd, right? The streetscape sometimes doesn't really match the way people move around. It needs to be culturally centric. You know, if we're not minding around how a roadway is designed so that it's really making sure that it's accommodating the way people move around, then you end up putting all this money and resources into infrastructure that actually doesn't help folks. Transit-oriented development also becomes out of reach because TOD developments tend to be more market rate, meaning that they're for a higher income bracket. We usually see this a lot. Boston is one of those few cities that does have what's called inclusionary development policy, which means that right now 13% of any multi-unit facility has to include affordable housing. But if you're in a community where the majority of residents are low income and you're building new housing and only 13% of that stock is affordable, and in a lot of ways that affordability sometimes is not even affordable to those residents, then you're actually creating a whole new housing market for people that don't live in that neighborhood. So that becomes, you know, people end up getting locked out of that access. And then of course, like as I said before, the gentrification displacement risk is so much bigger than just housing. We're also talking about it attracts different types of land market value to jump up, then making it less affordable for people to purchase homes or commercial spaces. Even for small businesses, the rent of a small business will tend to jump. So that ends up pushing, you know, mom and pop shops out. And then you start seeing more franchises coming up where there's less money being cycled back into the community. And so marginalized groups end up being the last to benefit from these changes. So that's why it's really important to make sure whenever you're making deep transportation improvements, it has to be paired with regulatory policy. And again, we'll talk about some of that work and actions that's happening right now through Action Regional Equity with the Special Protection Zones initiative. And we'll talk more about what zoning is and how that fits into this whole matrix. A quick example of transit that a transit project that had good intentions but ended up having a long-term negative impact on the community is the Atlanta Beltline. And so I'm going to share a couple articles, and we'll be sharing these at the end of the T-Talk as well when we send out the video and the notes. But just so that folks can follow along, this is a really great article that talks about some of the gentrification and displacement impacts of the Atlanta Beltline. But for those who are not familiar, the Atlanta Beltline is a 22-mile multi-transit trail that was built along an old railroad line that loops the entire city of Atlanta. That's why they call it the Beltline, because it kind of looks like it's belting around the city. This was a multi-billion-dollar project, and the development strategy behind this was they're going to build out transit and housing and commercial uses all along the Beltline, and it's going to strengthen opportunities. It's going to bring new jobs. And it started in 2005 with a completion date that's expected through 2030. But what we're already seeing, though, is residents are starting to experience deep displacement as it is. Unfortunately, the activities, because they weren't paired with protective policy, We saw an increase in residents being pushed out of their homes. Tax and home property values skyrocketed, which is great for people who want to sell their house. But if you don't want to sell your house and you're on a fixed income, that makes it very hard for you to afford. So this ended up impacting a lot of low-income residents who were already in, particularly in the southern part of Atlanta, where folks were kind of segregated into over the years. So we see this happening. There has been some conversations only in recent years about how to potentially circumvent all of this displacement. And it's great that that's happened. But it's only now that the city council is exploring to do some kind of policy to put a cap on the housing market costs in order to kind of keep folks in place. And some are suggesting that it might be too late. Some people are feeling like, there's already been so much massive displacement that it's going to be really hard to see a turnaround or a regression back to the rates where it was before. So whenever you talk about transit, you have to follow several things. One, you have to follow how does this impact the housing market? Do we see a jump in sale prices in homes in and around the area? For example, here in Mattapan, as part of the Mattapan Gentrification Mapping Project, which is an initiative that my organization is working on, we were analyzing the home values of triple deckers starting in early 2000s to present day. We found some triple deckers that in 2002 were $125,000 that now today are $1.3 million. That is like 10 times a spike in the housing costs. So because of all of the activity that's happening, you've got new transit that's coming to with the Fairmount line and with the bus lines to these neighborhoods. It's really making them become really attractive to developers. And there's a lot of what's called speculators. There's a lot of speculators who are people who are following the hot market and then are contacting residents and asking them to sell their house. You start noticing there are all these "We Buy Ugly Houses" signs that are popping up, or "We'll buy your house in cash" that are popping up in the communities that had never been there before. So all of these things are happening. And in the case of the Atlanta Beltline, as I said, it's only recently that folks are sort of reacting to this as they're seeing the displacement starting to happen more and more, and people are getting priced out and pushed out of their communities. So we want to avoid that kind of activity here in Boston. And we're looking at these other case studies. There are a lot of other different examples of rail communities that are very similar to the kinds of developments we're seeing here. And we're hoping to work closely with the coalitions that are working on this work, like Action, like Right to the City, and many others that are trying to find solutions to these challenges. Okay, next slide, please. All right, now I'm going to pass it to Marilyn Foreman, who's going to talk a little bit about the Fairmount Corridor history, which is a great local case study and example of everything going on. Marilyn.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you for that presentation too. I was just really enthralled in everything that you were saying there. It's good information. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. And I wanted to, really focus on the history of the Fairmount Corridor and how and why it became prevalent and important and necessary for us to work on a strategy to bring transit equity to communities of color. So I grew up in the Four Corners neighborhood of Dorchester, like right around the corner actually from where for the Four Corners Geneva Station is, off of Washington Street. And I can recall growing up standing right there on that bridge, waiting for the 23 bus so that I could go to Ashmont Station. And then take the red line so that I can go downtown, so I can go, you probably don't even remember the store Tello's or whatever, but I used to go shopping downtown. But it took a long time, but it was fun. I was a kid, I didn't mind. And I also remembered looking over the overpass and watching as the trains came through. Back then, there were a lot of not more cargo trains that were coming through. And I'm talking about maybe in the 70s. And the only thing that stood out that was about the trains was watching the circus train come through, because they had all the animals on the train, and we could stand there and I guess in a sense feeling like we were animals in a cage looking over at the animals on the train, which like we switched positions, we should have been there, but it was the animals and we were over, looking through the cage at the animals. But, fast forward a few years later came the Greater Four Corners Action Coalition, and, began to look at some of these things, and the buses that were coming through that were like, I actually used to like, as a kid, standing there at the bus stop and waiting for the bus, because the diesel fumes, for some strange reason, it smelled good to me as a kid, but wasn't good for us at all. But, the environmental impacts that it caused by, the fumes from those buses, but also why it took so long to get to wherever we needed to get to. I used to get in a lot of trouble going to school. I went to high school, Boston Technical High School, because either the bus was too crowded and it passed me by, or I just, it just took way too long. So as the Greater Four Corners Action Coalition began to do its assessing of the transportation line, they decided that, yeah, we need to have this rail stop in our community, because before there was, before they stopped stopping in making the stops in our neighborhoods, they used to. And at that time, it was a very Jewish community. And there, it was a legitimate stop, but, through the redlining and through the white flight, all of that changed. And so it became a line that was there, but not accessible for the people who lived there, who then became a predominantly Black and immigrant community. So they rallied up the troops to mobilize, to petition to the governor and everyone, saying that we needed to have these stops in our community, that we no longer wanted to sit and watch everyone else ride through our community and we couldn't ride the train, and it comes through our community. So in the late 90s, it actually came to fruition, and the governor did award, I want to say it was like $12 million initially, and for this line to get started. So we talked about like where we needed to have these stations. So Four Corners happened to be one. Mattapan happened to be the last one, Talbot Ave and New Market. We were successful in our campaigns, we're able to get money, we're able to work with MBTA to successfully bring the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition to our community. But our work is far, far from over. So we continue to work to build transit equity, to work with our community development corporations to help us put the housing for the people so that they can have access to get to work, to get to schools, and to get to shopping. So I'm going to start right there and pass it back to Alenza, I believe.
Thanks for that historical overview, Marilyn. So just to close out that piece of it, the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition's work led to a lawsuit with the state, basically arguing that the community is forced to breathe in the diesel particulates. So they're forced to breathe in these emissions from the train without having any benefit of using the transit system. And if you look closely at the map here, you'll see on the MBTA map that the Fairmount line kind of fills out what was once an empty space on the MBTA spider map, meaning that we didn't have any real rail access before. And that's what makes the Fairmount line so special, because it is the only commuter rail line that starts and ends within the city limits, because it's the only commuter rail line that it was created out of local activism. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly talk about the Fairmount network. So when the Fairmount line construction first began in 2002, it was finally completed in 2019 with the last station being completed. And in the midst of all that time, a lot of different groups started coming up, emerging, that were working on different aspects of issues in the communities. So first, and bear with me, Chevelle's going to click one by one because we're going to try to work with this animation, okay? So those first, one click, the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition, which started it all. Then next click is the CDC Collaborative, which was focused on housing. All the community development corporations came together. And then next click, the Fairmount Greenway Task Force, which was a group of neighborhood organizers that were working with the CDC Collaborative to develop a series of trails, like walking trails and green connectivity, connecting all the green spaces along the corridor. And then next one is the Fairmount Cultural Quarter, which is focused on arts and culture. And then there was the Jobs Network, which is focused on bringing these jobs to the quarter. As I mentioned before, there were a lot of opportunities for businesses to move into the neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods are already zoned for light industrial manufacturing because, in the prior to becoming part of the city in the early 1800s, the Fairmount neighborhoods were their own cities and were their own towns. And they were mostly mill towns, meaning they were mostly manufacturing and factory towns. So there are a lot of different job opportunities that are coming up today that could be brought into the neighborhoods. So that's what the Jobs Network was working on. And then the last one was the Corridor Economic and Community Group. So all the different groups that were working individually, we were trying to bring them all together to work in harmony. Thus having two more clicks, please, Shiva, I think. Thus bringing together all of the Fairmount groups to work together as a single unit, as a network. And next slide. So we did a lot of things. We filed a bill with then Representative Carvalho that's focused on increasing frequency on the line. We were able to win some of that. The Transit Coalition is spearheading the work to continue the frequency of service and also address the part of Reedville that still has a commuter rail price. That's the other big thing about the Fairmount line. It's the only line that has a entirely city fare because it runs within the city. And then we also started doing a series of other initiatives around the corridor as well, while supporting the existing coalitions. One in particular was the Fairmount Indigo Business Attraction and Retention Strategy. And essentially that was a strategy to identify what are some new types of businesses that can bring good paying jobs to residents that we want to bring into the corridor. When we found in this process of our research that there were actually a number of light industrial, like building trades types of businesses that were in the seaport, and when the seaport started getting built out, they got pushed out of the seaport. So we were trying to bring them, to attract them to come to and settle into the neighborhoods and commit to local hiring. In other words, commit to making sure that at least more than half of the people they hired were from the community. Likewise, we started to talk to some of these tech companies that are also based in the seaport and try to get them to commit to local hiring. And there was a lot of pushback, and it's a long and ongoing process. But then things started to emerge when the Fairmount line was extended by Mass DOT and the MBTA to Foxborough. And so those conversations shifted to focus on Foxborough and Patriot Place. The other study that we found was the other study that we led was increasing ridership on the Fairmount line. One of the pushbacks that we constantly heard from the state around increasing frequency of service is that they were saying, well, not enough people are using it. So if you can get the ridership up, then we'll consider raising, upping the frequency. So we decided to do our own study. We got a grant from the Boston Foundation and hired a research team called Nelson Nygaard. And we also hired a team of local community members. So residents who live in the neighborhoods, we trained them on how to do counts in order to count how many people were entering and exiting the train all day long for an entire week. And what we found when we did that study was the ridership had actually jumped by almost 200%. So the whole idea that people weren't using it was actually not true. People are starting to use the line and recognize that the line is for them. So we, right, Marilyn's like, teamwork makes the dream work, right? So we were able to bring that back to MBTA and Mass DOT and say, see, we got the ridership up. It's time to bring up that frequency. And soon afterwards, I mean, again, there were some hiccups and stuff, and we had to threaten to file another Title VI lawsuit and all those other things. But then MassDOT and MBTA came around and said, okay, we're going to increase the service. But that is only a slow percentage of where we want to go with the frequency of service. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and pass it on to Marilyn and Mia Johnson. And they're going to say a little bit more about all the great work that they're continuing to do through the Fairmount Transit Coalition and Action for Equity. So I will pass it back to you, Marilyn, and y'all can take it from here.
Thank you again. She does such a great job. It's like, what do I need to say? She said it all. But, teamwork truly does make the dream work, and our work continues. It's far from over. We still don't have the transit equity that we desire. But again, teamwork makes the dream work. So we invite folks from everywhere that especially live along the line to be a part of the movement so that we can get the transportation system that we need, that we deserve. And so as the Fairmount Transit Coalition continues, we are working now and asking our legislative body to present these bills that are going to, help to increase some of the things that we need to have happen, like the uniformity of the fares across the line. This is 9 miles of rail from South Station right through Reedville. And when you get to Reedville, there are still people of color and immigrants that live there, yet the fares are higher if you get on over in Reedville. We want a consistent fare across the board. And so we need people to help also say that. We need people also to help ride this line because it was here for us. The fight was all about equity, transit equity, so that we can get to jobs and where we needed to go in a minimal amount of time. People were losing jobs because they were getting there late. So this fight was about the people living along the line. So the fight is not over. Getting to shopping centers when you don't have a car, and they're making, because of advocacy work and the people that live in the communities, we're getting more and more, community shopping. And if you don't have a car, we need this rail. So again, this line is important for everyone who lives along to, be part of this movement so that we can get what we need so that shopping is accessible, getting to work is accessible, and all of that. Okay. Collaborative. Okay, so I don't know what that means. But anyway, yeah, so in my work, I work for the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. So we are developers of affordable housing. And there are a number that the collaborative exists to work in partnership. And maybe that's what the collaborative was all about. Collaboration was all about. So that, you know, people living along the line would have easy access to boarding transportation to get to where they need to go. So they didn't have to worry about coming up with extra money. To own a car in the city of Boston is ridiculous, you know, unless you're making a whole lot of money. Insurance is through the roof. It just costs a lot of money. So why not have a public transportation system that works for us, for all of us? We waited for a long time. We're always at the back of the bus, no pun intended, but we're always in the back. So why not push forward to get the things that we want? We're asking for these bills to pass to make this easy. We're asking for more affordable housing so that people can have access without having to worry about driving from wherever to get to somewhere, to hop on a bus, to get to the job, to get there late, to get to daycare, to get to shopping and all of that. So our work continues, and we have partners that are helping, you know, working together to make every aspect from every angle better and more affordable and accessible for folks living along those 9 miles. So if it's a job that you want to keep, we want to make sure that you're making enough money, because that has always been an issue too. So I want to hand it over to Mia to talk a little bit about like that Jobs Action Network and how it works hand in hand with the work of the Fairmount Indigo Transit Coalition and the Collaborative, what that exactly does for us. Mia.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, everyone. So good to be here this evening. I get a little over sensorized with all the being on camera, so I'm glad to be here with you all. But please don't take offense when I go off camera. It's just my overstimulation. Yeah, so I work as the community organizer for Action for Equity. We are based in Four Corners and have been around for 7 years, but have been connected to 2 organizations that we came out of, which is Action for Regional Equity and On the Move Coalition. Was a transportation environmental justice coalition that merged together to create what we are doing. So some of this work comes from folks who are doing that work with us and alongside us and have like become a part of the organization that we're a part of. And then we grew in building into our jobs work and recognizing that we've had a long vision, 25 years of seeing the impact of economics and jobs and access, which the train and this Indigo Line represent. But it doesn't just represent that, it also represents what does it mean to be able to stay and remain, right? What does it mean to be intergenerational? What does it mean to be able to imagine your family being here for more than one generation? Which, you know, in the 90s when they were restoring many of these neighborhoods and taking them back, and there was a lot of excitement around that in the late 80s and early 90s, we began to see a shift, right? Recently, as gentrification moved forward, of beginning to push people who had fought for the neighborhoods that they're in, and Four Corners in this neighborhood and along the corridor, these neighborhoods were impacted by that same push of like fighting to remain, fighting to stay after burnout, after white flight, after redlining, and continuing to make their homes their place, and finding work. So part of our so I'm saying all that and kind of just recovering some of that history of the neighborhoods that are along the corridor, and particularly at Four Corners. I'm saying all that because one of the things that we discovered in looking at economics and looking at jobs is that we're not just like any job along the corridor, because you can get a job It doesn't mean it will pay your bills. It doesn't mean you won't need to get 3 more jobs. It doesn't mean, you know, and we're like, wait a minute, we need good jobs. We need people to have access to good jobs. And at a base, that's a $70,000 salary. And what we also found is that the majority of our community have some college education, have master's degrees, have doctorates, and are not getting a $70,000 job. They're just are not having access to it. So then we were like, why? What is going on? So first, you know, you start going down the list. What are the things that are not happening, right? And so one of them was they can't get there. You know, the jobs are in where they were in downtown. They were like hubbed in downtown and Back Bay. And then when they built at the seaport, then they're hubbed down there. And we can't get there. If you can't get to your job on time, you're going to lose your job. Like that's just, you know, this is not, we're not talking rocket science. We're not talking things that are difficult to understand. If you can't have reliable transportation to get to the job, right? And there's no parking down in these areas. All the parking requires more money, right? So even if we get a job that you're making 50,000, you can't pay for that and your parking and the insurance and the especially if you live in Dorchester, right? And Mattapan, where they've hiked up all of the insurance because you're next to the highway, right? So just the gentrification that happens to insurance and that system on people in our neighborhoods along the corridor is real. So we were like, okay, so we have an access issue. And I know Lensa spoke about it, and Marilyn spoke about kind of the initial fight, the continued fight around that. We have an ongoing one right now. I'll speak about that a little bit later. And then we were like, okay, so we have this good job problem, but no one's identifying what the good job is. We did all this research and went out and talked to people and looked at what was in the field and what kind of, and then we realized, oh my God, not only is it that we don't have access, people don't even know about these jobs. They don't know what the jobs are. They don't know the tech jobs. They don't know what, you know, who, they don't have the network, right? So when if you don't, you know, a job is about who you know. As much as you can send a resume in, and there's a whole bunch of bias in that, and anybody who does the diversity, equity, and inclusion work right now, or what was formerly, you know, affirmative action with city jobs, like any of that kind of work, and you're going to see over time, the last 30 years, people, if you didn't have a contact or a connection in that department or in that hospital or in that, you're being earmarked for low wage jobs. You're going to get a job, but it's not going to be the job that you maybe are most qualified for, or could be with some internal training and support, right? And so that's what we noticed was happening. And we're like, wait a minute. So not only if we get people into the jobs and we improve the transit system a little bit so they can use it, there's still this problem of they get pushed out because the type of pay, the type of quality is still not sufficient. So then we, you know, so we looked at transportation, we looked at jobs, and our organization also looks at housing and like what are the different types of social structures of housing that we're dealing with, right? And Alonzo spoke to the transit-oriented development, which is along the corridor, along that 9 miles. That's like a couple miles on each side of that, right? A half a mile on each side of this train is significant for who has access to this transportation, the potential of a good job, especially if they have access to a network or can build access to the network and utilize their education that they spent a bunch of money on, right? And then get advocacy and support around it because they were still requiring a lot of that work to happen in order for people to really get into that field and stay there, right? Their housing is being pulled out from underneath them. And at a rapid rate, right? It's either being bought and sold or people are like selling because their family is moving to the South Shore because they can't buy homes or even condos. And they're like, why buy a condo if I can buy a whole house, right? I can buy a house in Randolph. You know, so this is happening at this like, like, I don't even know how to say right. I don't even know what that word is, right? It's just so fast. It's like, I feel like it's like watching like a 3D movie coming at you and you don't put on the 3D glasses, right? It's just like, you're like, what is going on right now? And so about 7, 8 years ago, we've been observing this, right? It's 25 years. I'm like working on this, working on one area, working on the next area, pulling in the next area, putting this together, doing this. And you hear this is the coalition, there's this network, there's this, and all these different ways of configuring ourselves to combat this issue, right? And really is to remain, the right to remain in our own communities, the right to stay as not as a handout or a privilege, as a right to be human in our own communities. We spent all this time living and surviving in. And so this is what bore the special protection zones. Their technical term is an overlay district. An overlay district is something, so if you imagine a map, and it's why I was saying that like the half a mile on each side is the overlay along the Fairmount corridor. So it would be protected. It's challenging because we've been talking about this. I'm trying to get people to be like, yes, we're going to sign on as the rents increase, as mortgages shift, as people get moved out. Well, we're still fighting for like anybody we can keep to stay in, right? And so we've been talking with the city about petitioning them to create an overlay district that does just that, that combats these things specifically, right? And so each of these things has a different and it holds different groups work, right? So it's not just like as Action for Equity, we're like holding on to like all the pieces. We may be at the table or with each different group that's working on something, but it encompasses a lot of things. So I'm just going to read the list of a couple of things. So sometimes people call this, and you'll see it in like a few other cities that have worked on overlay districts as well. They call it anti-displacement zones is another term you might hear people use. But really what it is a half a mile on either side of the Fairmount line, holding as a starting place, right? We're saying as a starting place, you're going to start in the Black community of Boston. You're going to start along this line. That was a space that was intentionally left behind. It was intentionally with policy, with planning left behind. On purpose and planned. And so we're saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. And we're going to start here. We're not going to go to the Green Line extension and act like, okay, we're going to put an overlay district now that we've created this extension. We're like, yes, it needs that. Brighton Alston might also need that, but we're going to start here in Dorchester, in the neighborhoods that have been most impacted and carrying the burden of the impact of all of these things here. So just going to read a couple things out. So specifically, we want to protect current residents from being displaced from housing, job access, and other network and tools, right? So the other part about, and I mentioned this just briefly, the other part about getting into this good job is you might be the only person in that field, in tech, in biotech, in hospitals. It's not shifted to the lower paying jobs, but you might be the only person in that office. You might be the only person that, and so you need that resource of community support around you when you come home from that, right? Because it has a huge burden, particularly as there's a lot of resistance in diversity, equity, and inclusion of like giving it a nod, like, yes, we did it, we took a class, but not actually pragmatism in a pragmatic way, implementing the change within the institution so that people can feel like they can show up as themselves and get their work done and be supported and trained properly. So this is really important when we talk about networks. It's not just a network that creates access, but a network of support and care that comes as being remaining a part of your community. Okay. Maintaining current demographic, racial, ethnic, and economic character. So as we move through gentrification, which is already happening, we're like, okay, clearly we haven't stopped it. We need to figure out another way to antagonize gentrification. So how do we do that? How do we create improvements in our community without losing our community, without losing access to our community, without losing our home, right? And so that's where we're drawing in, and being designated in the zoning code, which is how this designation happens, as a new type of zoning overlay district with special standards and programs. And there's a list of what these programs are. It's rather extensive. I can share that later or like afterward, so people can look at that. One of the things is it's called Article 91. At the end of December, we held a hearing at the City Council that was called in by two of the council people. One of them is Council Kendra, who is interested in this because she wants to use it in her area, right? And there's a couple councilors, they want to use it in the areas that they oversee, which are not in Dorchester and along the corridor. And so our emphasis again is we want this to pass and become something that is possible to use in other districts and other places. But we want to start here. We want to start where it began And we want to, with the understanding that it began along the corridor for a reason. And we still have enough community that is living here that will be protected by it, right? And businesses can thrive as an example of what it means to invest in our communities with policy, right? So zoning policy, zoning rules create the opportunity for policy shifts and change to actually create stability in our community. And so far they've been used a lot of times against the betterment of our community. So I'm going to pause there on that note. And then I'm also going to say, because I had mentioned it earlier, that we are also, and I know some other folks are involved in this, we've been a part of the bus network redesign, which is also connected to this corridor, because we've been really looking at syncing the buses with the train. Like, it seems like it's a crazy idea that your bus would stop around the time, especially since it's every 45 minutes, right? That you could get off the 23 and within the next 5 minutes be able to get on the train that comes every 45 minutes, right? Like, it's not like this is difficult, but apparently it's very difficult. And they've been pushing really hard against this. As Alensa had mentioned in the history of this, the fight to get more regular service has also been tied to the sinking of the other of the bus lines, which are predominantly how people are moving around if you're not in a car or a bike or a scooter, right? Is using the bus network to move around. So right now there's a 5-year process of the bus network redesign that was voted on. Let's see your face, Alyssa. It was voted on recently. It's a very challenging process. It was voted on in December 15th. There is a MBTA board meeting where you can put public comment in. I'm going to share a link that we've been collecting data on, speaking about how our communities are accessing and using the bus service and what they want to see. So I'm going to drop that link in the comment, but please feel free also to join the January 25th MBTA board meeting that's going to bring up again, they're being really tasked to really monitor the implementation since they rapidly push through the approval process. So we really need to hold their toes to the fire around implementation of how they go about implementing this plan, which they said would be flexible. But we'll see. You know, they say a lot of things when they want to pass things. So that is what I'm going to leave you all with. I would love to hear your questions, and I'm going to pass this back to our lovely facilitators who've just done a wonderful job tonight.
Thank you so much, Marilyn and Mia, for your wonderful presentations. I did put something in the chat. I just want to reiterate it here that we can't talk about transportation if we don't talk about jobs. We can't talk about jobs if we don't talk about housing. Can't talk about housing if you can't talk about food access and climate change and all of these things. All of these things are intersecting in our lives, and we have to address all of these issues simultaneously to make sure that our residents could stay where they deserve to stay in and live in the community which they grew up. So just like Mia said, I will turn it over to you all to ask any questions or say anything that sparked your head, any ideas or any comments. And then if there isn't any, that's totally okay. And we'll end the meeting early.
I wanted to just add one thing that maybe it'll spark someone to ask a question, but also one of the really important things that we are doing now is trying to get this line electrified. Why are we trying to get this line electrified? Well, right now it's not. And we know that in our communities, like asthma rate, respiratory issues, and so forth are a problem. So so we're working on trying to have a bill filed so that we can sort of put this in gear and fast forward it so that we can get the T to electrify this line sooner than later. It's going to benefit all of us. We also want to change that 45-minute ride to 30, maybe 15 minutes, and then sort of synchronize the bus schedule so that everything is like clockwork. So we're moving right along and everything is on time. I'm happy that Carlene shared that the attendance or the ridership on the Fairmount line is increasing. And, you know, I know COVID was a bad thing, but thanks to COVID, everyone had no choice. I mean, they rode the commuter rail because they didn't want to get on a crowded bus. So they got on a line that they thought nobody was using. So now folks are using the line and it's wonderful, but we still have far to go and we can't do it without each of us doing their part. So, it's about bills and understanding how that works. And that is what Kendra actually put in the chat. So there is going to be an opportunity to be a part of a community action hour on Thursday, next Thursday, the 24th. And there's a link that she put in the chat for you to go and to register for that Zoom meeting. So be a part of that and learn about how simple it is for you to be a part of a democratic process to change the way that we are living right now, but improving the quality of life for all of us and our children and our children's children. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you. Ken, I see your comment. Yeah, I agree. It is a lie that's told, and it's also, and there's also a way in which we need to be very clear about what it is that we're talking about, right? Because there is a way that we improve things, and now because of the ways that we see things as being improved, we also see the possibility of losing, right? And it's not just seeing, people experience the possibility of losing, experience displacement, experience removal, right? So you know, go ahead, Ken. Let's be a little, let's get juicy.
It's very sad for me to find that people say, well, I don't want a transportation improvement because it just means I'll be moved out of my house and I won't be there when it happens. But that's a real threat. And it is something that most transportation people say, well, I don't have anything to do with that. That's a housing issue, or that's a jobs issue, or that's a whatever social issue. And we're just doing transportation. But the two are so intimately connected, as you have already said. And so I think understanding the pressures from the real estate industry, from the developers, is something that's an essential piece to the whole equation. And that book, anyway, I'm only partway through it, by Leslie Kern, who's Canadian, seems to be written from the viewpoint of people in poor neighborhoods, which is very unusual. It's not just a planner's book. This is what happens over there. It seems to be, even though she's now living somewhere even outside of Canada, I think, in some rural spot, she seems to have gotten into the heart of some neighborhoods, particularly in Toronto, and come up with some observations that I think are very important to try to understand, as we hope to be able to do things that are good transportation improvements and not displace the people who deserve to have the benefits. Thanks.
Great points,
Yeah.
Ken. Thank you for that. Marilyn, do you want to respond to that or add to that? And then we'll go to Darlene.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, you know, I mean, we don't live in a rural context, but I've organized in rural contexts, and they're being displaced too. You know, the level of farming that's being shut down, the people removing from farming, from, you know, homes that they've homesteaded for a long time or inherited. That land is being sold and scooped up by corporations almost as rapidly as it is happening in the cities. So just keeping in mind that, like, as we do this. This is not just, it's not just an urban, you know, I think there's a mythology that is happening to the urban people, that like the urban people are causing, you know, it's not. The corporate greed is happening everywhere.
Hi, I'm Darlene Harrison. I'm a Tall Bernard residence leader. And recently, my daughter used to catch the 26 bus to work. And she said they have the 26 bus come from Ashmont, but it doesn't bring you back. They don't have a bus that comes back to Ashmont. And she was like, well, how are you supposed to get back from work? Someone has to pick you up. I don't know why that happened. And I think more residents need to get involved because that needs to be changed. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the first network things they did. They used dot points of people during the pandemic that were on their phones, so it was anonymous, collect data about how people were using it. I'm like, oh, what a great time to see when people are using something when everyone's at their home because they have to be. Excellent decision making. So this is where we are. But yeah, that's part of it. So please fill out the data. We'll definitely fill out the survey that I dropped into the link and share it with your daughter. We can then make sure to get more information out to you about how to be connected to this process, because it is part of the thing, is that they think that they plan this wonderful process without really involving community.
That's why it's
And if it-
very important to be involved and to share your voice, because oftentimes when big corporations and big industries think that you're not paying attention, and we have a history of sometimes thinking somebody else has to do it and not us, that's what happens. They make these decisions for us. No, we have to come together, we have to mobilize, and we have to talk about these real things that impact us and make the difference.
No, just creating awkward, quiet space, that's okay. Also, if anyone wants to share something, but they don't feel comfortable being recorded, I can stop the recording if you all would like to do that. I know sometimes it could be a little much to be recorded. I'll just wait a couple more seconds just to see if anything comes up for anybody.
I have a curiosity. Maybe this can be a show of hands or something in the virtual hand world. But my curiosity is, how many people have ridden the Indigo Line? And I like to call it the Indigo Line because that's what it needs to be called, because it's part of the transit system. It serves only our city. It doesn't serve anywhere else. It's not a commuter rail. Unless you're being very broad about commuting and being like, I use all kinds of means to commute, my feet, the car, a bus, a skateboard. It's not commuter rail. It's part of the transit system. So yeah, and if you haven't, like, the other thing too is to know that, like, if you haven't ridden it but you want to ride it, you can get an A1 pass and ride it just like you ride the train. You just show them your pass. It doesn't cost you, unless you're getting on at Reedville, as you heard. We're still fighting the Reedville fight. This is ridiculous. But yeah, you can ride it, and you can get to like South Bay in like 2 seconds. So hit up your Tuesday movie for a deal, grab yourself a little bite, and then catch the train there, catch the train back, I mean, you don't even have to, you don't have to deal with cars, you don't have to deal with traffic, you don't have to worry about someone breaking into your car. You can just get there, come back, and be all good. It's a great date night, just FYI, and you'll be flying. You'll be fly. All right. So in case you're wondering, you're really impressive date night. In case you're wondering.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a cue to end our night. I want to thank you all again for coming to join Alensa and I for our 9th Tea Talk titled Transportation and Jobs. And I hope that to see you at the next Tea Talk. Have a good night, y'all.
Have a good night, everyone.